Hi, my name is Francisco Marmolejo Cossío. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, working in David Parks's group, and I wanted to apologize in advance for the fact that I'm unfortunately unable to give this talk in real time this week. But I'm thankful for the opportunity to record this work and to share it with the department. It's a real honor to be invited to speak in the DeFi seminar series. And again, as I mentioned to Nir, even though I can't present in real time this week, I'm more than glad to answer any questions that anybody might have offline. Please feel free to send me an email. I'll be sharing my email details throughout the talk. Exactly. So without further ado, let me just share my screen just a second. Okay. Great. There we go. So again, thank you very much for the invitation. For this talk, I'll be talking about some recent work with colleagues here at Harvard University. I'll list it here in the initial slide, but this work is on differential liquidity provision in Uniswap v3 and on implications for contract design, for v3 contract design. And so just to begin, I'd like to give kind of an outline of what we'll be covering today. Since we have some time, actually, what I'll begin by doing is by going over decentralized exchanges and at a kind of a broad level, and then use this to define the objective of the work and to really delve into what we're focusing on in this case, and which in this case is on contract design for decentralized exchange contracts in the form of V3 with the tools that we develop further on in the talk. I'll then kind of delve into more of the specifics of Uniswap, both V2 and V3, and then introduce the machinery for how we measure the profit and loss of liquidity providers specifically over a specific time horizon. And we'll end by providing some computational and empirical results that allow us to glean some potential insights on incentives for liquidity providers in Uniswap v3. And so, well, decentralized exchanges, which are kind of the object of study that we're looking at, these are smart contracts that facilitate trade between tokens on a blockchain. And again, this has multiple desirable properties. I mean, the big question that people are often asking in the first place is, well, what's the point of having a decentralized versus centralized exchange? Well, first of all, it requires not trusting individuals on a centralized exchange, which is something which very recently we've seen can actually be a big issue. There are issues of trust with respect to how centralized exchanges are run. And once more, a centralized exchange also brings a centralization of assets, so it becomes a bigger target for potential hacking. And so decentralized exchanges also have potentially more robustness to hacks. And furthermore, they're always operating. They're always running on the blockchain. So one can interact with them at any moment of time. And what's interesting about decentralized exchanges is that there are some blockchain unique implementations that have been created with the constraints of blockchain-based cryptocurrencies in mind. And in particular, the one that we'll be talking about more in this talk is that of constant function market makers as a decentralized exchange. And this is already a massive application in DeFi, if not one of the biggest, where the daily trade volume of Uniswap contracts is in the order of more than 100 million USD. And there's a paramount and an equal commensurate amount of liquidity that's also locked in these contracts. So really, it already is a big application that's being deployed and used consistently on blockchains. And so so now that we've talked a little bit about decentralized exchanges, what are the main objectives that we seek to focus on for this work? Well, the first objective that we tackle is that of explicitly providing expressions for the profit and loss of liquidity providers over a specific time horizon. And as we'll see, what this time horizon is going to include, it's going to include changes to both the intrinsic price of assets in a contract, but also market prices as they evolve over time. And what we'll be able to do with this is that we'll be able to cast the static liquidity provision problem of optimal liquidity provision as an optimization problem, which will be a reasonable optimization for small liquidity providers on a smaller time horizon. And moreover, and this is actually the third point, is where more of the contract design comes in, is that we'll see that the functionality of V3 Uniswap over V2 comes at a larger computational cost. And this computational overhead of the smart contract then gets passed on to traders as gas fees. And so we're able to express some of this computational overhead that comes from the more complex methodology used in V3. And as a consequence, we're able to understand the trade-off between this and the potential increased efficiencies in Uniswap V3. And finally, and as I mentioned, precisely, we'll use these tools to understand LP behavior, but also try to balance these trade-offs that we have going from V2 to V3 contracts as the contracts go in increasing complexity. And so I'll begin by giving a broad overview of Uniswap. This will be useful to contextualize a little bit of the expressions that we have later on and some of the tools that we have later on. And so we'll begin with V2, the older version of Uniswap. And what we'll be assuming in this work is that, well, V2 contracts are going to be trading between two tokens that are available on chain. And we'll consistently be calling them token A and token B. And henceforth, we're going to assume that token B is numeraire, so that utility for agents are really, their desire is to maximize their profits in terms of token B. So really that's the currency of preference. And V2 is a Uniswap V2 contract is what we call an automated market maker. Again, trades are being continuously made by the contract at a specific price that we'll see the mechanism of how it's set. And what happens is that there's a functional invariant that's maintained by the contract, which is that the product of the reserves, it remains constant. And so so let's begin by looking at V2 trade dynamics. So again, I mentioned that we have this contract. This contract has a certain amount of reserves in token A and token B. We're going to let the tuple XY generally denote the reserves that the contract has in terms of both of these tokens. And I mentioned before that there is a functional invariant that's respected by this contract, and it's precisely that the product of both of these two values is constant. So in this case, we can express this invariant by the expression x times y is equal to L squared. And what we'll say, again, L squared is a constant, and we'll say that this contract is L units of liquidity. And so what happens when there's a trade is that a trader, for example, will send units of one token to the contract and receive units of the other token in the contract. And so let's suppose that the trader is sending delta X units of token A to the contract. Then what first happens is that a portion of these tokens that are sent to the contract is skimmed. And these are the famous fees that are to be shared amongst liquidity providers. How much is skimmed is modulated by a parameter, gamma, and these are the fee tiers of a Uniswap V2 and V3 contract. So in this case, we see the three different fee tiers from lowest to highest right here in the slide. But first, these fees are skimmed, and they're shared proportionally amongst liquidity providers. And I'll talk about what I mean by proportionally in just a couple of slides. But after this happens, the remaining amount, the 1 minus gamma times delta X, these are used to trade along the V2 curve. And so what I mean by trading along the V2 curve is also here on the x-axis, we have the reserves in token A, and on the y-axis, we have reserves in token B. And remember I mentioned that the product of both x and y remains constant. It's equal to L squared. And what happens is that then we obtain this blue line, this hyperbola. And trades, the 1 minus gamma delta X that we had from before, are going to move the assets of the contract along this blue line. This is what we call the V2 reserve curve. And so the amount that the trader is going to receive after having sent delta X is precisely the second expression right here. this delta Y, that satisfies this product below. And what we can see is that the contract price, so as in the limit, as we make smaller and smaller trades, we get this instantaneous price of an asset. Because the larger the trade, we actually see some slippage in the trade along this curve. But taking the limit as the trade amount goes to zero, the ratio of the spot price that I'm getting for token B in terms of token A is precisely this ratio Y over X. So really, we have a very clean formulation in V2. And what's interesting is that we can, and for the smart contract that's enforcing the V2 Uniswap automated market maker, we can express the state of the contract in two different ways. On one hand, as we've used before, we have reserves. We have the X and Y values, and we see this point along the curve, and that's the state of the contract. And that, moreover, tells us that once we have X and Y, we know the price, as we saw before. But equivalently, we can also express the state of the contract in terms of the liquidity that it holds and the price, the instantaneous price at that moment of time. And again, this is just a moment's thought, because from before we saw that X times Y is going to be equal to L squared, from which we can extrapolate L. And the price is simply the ratio of the assets that we have. So really, these are both equivalent representations of the reserve curve that we saw before. But what's nice about this second representation, and we'll see a lot of this way of thinking carrying over to how V3 operates, is that traders update the contract state by changing the price. They move along the curve, and the instantaneous price, the slope, the tangent slope along the hyperbola changes. Liquidity providers, on the other hand, update the contract state by changing the liquidity amount. So both of the agents are each correspondingly changing each of these two variables in this second, more convenient form of expressing the contract state. And liquidity providers, they either create or take away liquidity, and this is called minting or burning liquidity. And so just to delve a little bit more into the mechanics of minting and burning, so suppose, remember, we have a price P, and we have a current state, a certain amount of liquidity, and then there's a certain price P. Then in order to mint new liquidity, what a liquidity provider needs to do is that they need to send a bundle of tokens to the contract. And the bundle of tokens that they send is simply, in this case, X prime, Y prime. Again, the X prime representing token A and Y prime representing token B, that must satisfy the constraint that the ratio of both of these tokens is matching with the current price. And moreover, it must also satisfy the fact that the product of both of these two tokens in this bundle that I'm sending to the contract is the square of the amount of liquidity that I want to mint. And once this is the case, then this bundle is sent to the contract. It's added to the reserves that exist of token A and token B. And now the contract state changes to precisely both of these two representations. As we can see, the first one is simply adding the reserves to the contract in the commensurate proportions. The second one is, again, a little bit more more towards the direction, the fact that liquidity providers only change the liquidity of the contract state. So they've added L prime units of liquidity to the contract by minting this liquidity. And almost identically, if a liquidity provider has a claim to a certain amount of units that they've minted in the past to the contract, then they can recover this liquidity from the contract at any moment of time. To do so, we say that they burn liquidity, and they simply take away a bundle from the contract that is defined identically. It's a bundle that is in proportion according to the current instantaneous price of the contract. And once more, the contract state is going to change in such a way that these assets are taken away from the reserves, and the liquidity changes by the desired amount. So that was kind of an overview of V2, and V3 very elegantly builds upon this. So the first thing to notice about Uniswap V2 is that liquidity providers are providing bundles of tokens that are used for trading by traders that have the property that no matter what the price of the asset is, no matter where we are on that reserve curve that I mentioned before, the liquidity that one has provided will be used for trading at any of these prices. And what V3 does is that it extends the action space of the liquidity provider. And so now as a liquidity provider, in V2, I was simply deciding how much liquidity I was going to allocate over the entire interval of potential prices that assets can be traded at. Now for V3, I'm given the added expressivity of being able to decide intervals of price ranges over which my liquidity will be used to trade. And so again, so this added functionality of being able to choose at what price points my liquidity is used for trading is what we call this concentrated liquidity provision. And this has many implications for liquidity providers that we'll delve a little bit more into the details just shortly. But the first is that, well, if I want to mint liquidity, so now again, my liquidity has to be contextualized by the interval over which it's defined. But now if I mint liquidity over a smaller interval, then this is going to roughly require a smaller token bundle than a larger interval. And so in a certain sense, if you think about liquidity provision, minting liquidity as purchasing liquidity, it becomes cheaper in a certain sense to buy smaller intervals worth of liquidity. At the same time, since my liquidity, remember fees for a liquidity provider are accrued when your liquidity is used for trading. So your liquidity is only going to be used for trading if that price is in the interval which you specified. And so fees, you'll only be accruing fees if the price remains in that interval, in this case, AB. And once more, the fees that are accrued by the contract in that interval are shared proportionally amongst all of the liquidity providers who have provided liquidity in that interval. So again, this is already a trade-off to be thinking about. But another trade-off, which is equally important that we'll get into more of the specifics of, is this notion of impermanent loss that we'll define precisely. And by impermanent loss, really what we mean is that the value of the assets that you provide to the contract as a liquidity provider, they change in terms of as the price of the assets change as well. And the assets that you have a claim to when you burn liquidity correspondingly can be worth more or less than when you minted them in the first place. And this notion of the value of the assets as I recover them from the contract is the core aspect of impermanent loss. And one thing that we'll see with the V3 contracts is that this loss that happens also in V2 can be worse in V3 for smaller intervals. So really at the end of the day, we'll see that liquidity providers have to balance a handful of different things. They can potentially get more fees, but at a potentially higher risk. And so the question of how to allocate liquidity becomes an interesting research question as well. And so now we can delve a little bit more into the details of V3. And so the first thing that a V3 contract is specifying is a partition of price space. And again, I mentioned that liquidity providers are able to differentially allocate liquidity to different prices. So to begin with, there's a discretization of price space, and there are these buckets, as we call them, B subindex I for the I bucket. And we have a finite number of buckets that cover the entirety of price. And prices in a contract, the instantaneous prices can range anywhere from 0 to infinity. So these buckets partition the real numbers from 0 non-inclusive to infinity. And in V3, the buckets are specified. They actually have what we call an exponential bucketing scheme, where the buckets are exponentially spaced apart with a base of the exponent given by theta, in this case of 1.0001. And there's this interesting parameter in V3 contracts called tick spacing, where we see all of these ith powers of theta that exist along the real line as prices. Now, which buckets are used for a contract is modulated as a variable in the contract called tick spacing. So at tick spacing of 1, every single tick that I mentioned is used as an endpoint of a bucket, and you can allocate liquidity anywhere inside of these buckets. But at tick spacing of 10, for example, then the buckets become 10 times as large. And essentially, the endpoints of buckets they encompass 10 of the individual ticks from delta is equal to 1. And so correspondingly, this partition, as delta becomes larger, the partition of price space becomes coarser, is really the takeaway from this expression. And so we go back to the notion of contract state. Remember, in V2 we had a very convenient contract state in terms of the reserves and in terms of liquidity and price. This is unfortunately going to be a bit more complicated for V3, but one thing that we can assume is that the contract is maintaining an instantaneous price of the asset, in this case of token A in terms of token B, and this is given by a positive real number. And the contract is also going to maintain, so remember we had liquidity and price was the previous contract state. Now liquidity is not just a real number, unfortunately. It depends on where people have allocated liquidity. So the way that we represent liquidity is we have, in this case, assume that we have D liquidity providers, so DLPs, and we're going to have a mapping from every single one of the liquidity providers to a bucket to which they allocate liquidity. And this mapping we'll call sigma, where sigma I is, if I'm the ith liquidity provider, it's where I've allocated my liquidity to. And the amount of liquidity that I've minted in the ith bucket is going to be denoted by capital L subindex, in this case I, for me being the ith liquidity provider. And a couple of assumptions actually that are important is that we're going to assume that without loss of generality, that this is a surjective function, and that and that also that a liquidity provider only provides liquidity to a single bucket. So these are actually two assumptions without loss of generality. The first, the surjectivity of the mapping actually comes from the fact that when a V3 contract is made, a certain amount of liquidity has to be allocated over the entire price space. So all buckets have at least a little bit of liquidity to begin with. And the second assumption, namely that a liquidity provider is only providing liquidity to a single bucket, comes from the fact that if I want to allocate 10 units of liquidity to 3 adjacent buckets, which is a larger interval, this is identical to allocating 10 units of liquidity to each of the contiguous buckets separately. So really we can pretend that every liquidity provider is just allocating to a single bucket. But the important thing here is that the state now is we have a price and these two parameters, sigma and L, which encapsulate the landscape of how liquidity providers have allocated liquidity. And so the important thing here is, well, in V2, we had units of liquidity over the entire price space. Now, for every single one of the buckets, we're going to have what we mean by liquidity in that bucket. And we're going to call these liquidity units for the ith bucket BI liquidity units. And as before, when you were purchasing liquidity over the entire price space, there was a certain equivalence between bundles of tokens and units of liquidity at a given price. And this exact same thing occurs now for the specific bucket that we're looking at. And we specify this equivalence with this function v superindex 3. What this is saying really right here is that if I want to mint L units of liquidity, this V3 LPBI, if I want to mint L units of liquidity and the current price is P for the ith bucket, then the corresponding bundle is the right-hand side of the expression, which has 3 different cases depending on when the price is, whether it's to the left, within, or to the right of the interval of the bucket. So really no need to delve into too many details here, but there is this equivalence between units of liquidity in a given bucket and bundles of tokens of token A and token B. And similar to V2, I remember in V2, the important thing was that traders changed the price, liquidity providers changed the liquidity. So in this case, the same thing happens where traders change the price, and what liquidity providers do is they change sigma and L via mints and burns. And so in practice, I can arrive and I can say, well, I want to mint 3 units of liquidity in the 10th bucket. I send those units of tokens to the contract, or or if I want to burn, I receive those commensurate units. And similarly, as I was mentioning a little bit earlier, the actual functionality in V3 is that I can actually mint a position over a set of contiguous buckets. Because really, if I want to mint over a larger interval, in this case, AR to BS, this is equivalent to minting the units of liquidity individually in every single one of the contiguous buckets. But the contract itself really only needs to keep track of the endpoints of the interval that I'm allocating liquidity to. And these endpoints of, in this case, R and S, AR and BS in the example above, are what we call active ticks. So that's kind of the dynamics of minting and burning liquidity. Trading is a little bit more complicated to express, but intuitively, it's very similar to V2. Essentially, suppose that the price is in a given bucket. Remember, we're assuming a price, so it's in the I star bucket. So this is the active bucket. Now, any liquidity provider who has provided liquidity to this bucket we call them an active liquidity provider. And all of the liquidity that is in this bucket, which we know because we know where people have allocated their liquidity, is what we call the active liquidity. And like before, we can assume that a trader is going to send a certain unit of token A to the contract, delta X. A certain amount is going to be skimmed, and it's going to be shared amongst active liquidity providers. And the remaining amount is going to be used to trade along the V3 curve. And we're going to visualize the V3 curve in the next slide. So the V3 curve is, if we have, this blue curve is what it would be if we had the L star units of liquidity in a V2 contract. And this picture really is showing from as prices range from point A to point B, the right hand black point actually being the lower price and the upper one being the larger price. As prices range from that point, what we do is we take the V3 curve and we move it via an affine transformation to the V2 curve, and map it via an affine transformation to the V3 curve, which is the red one that we see right here. And trading along the V3 curve while the price is in the bucket is the same thing as moving along this red curve. And the benefit of this, and this is actually where we see the savings, or the fact that purchasing liquidity over smaller intervals is cheaper in a certain sense, is that this quantity, if you wanted to support these same movements in a V2 contract and have this blue curve, but if prices remained inside of this interval, inside of these two black points, there is some liquidity that would never be used. In this case, XB units of token A and YA units of token B, these dotted lines would never be used if prices stayed in that interval. And so by moving things via this affine transformation, you're allowing the same movements, the same dynamics across the curve, but having the savings of the fact that for prices that are outside of that range, you don't need to use that liquidity. And just as a final note, well, everything that I've talked about right now is very local in the description of V3. Namely, we have per bucket what's happening and what we're allocating. But oftentimes when you look at the aggregate of things going on in V3, what you see is you actually get a different but also equally useful representation, which is on the left-hand side right here. What I've mapped is the units of liquidity for a given bucket over the price space. And typically when you look at V3 contracts, you see an aggregation of liquidity where this peak might be close to the current price of an asset. And so most liquidity providers are coming in and allocating their liquidity close to this given price. And what happens is I described the V3 trade dynamics previously at the bucket per bucket level, but you can stitch this all together to get a trading curve like this blue curve that we see in V2 contracts. And when you stitch it all together and you get an aggregate trading curve, you get something that looks a little bit more like this, where it's still convex, and you still get this decreasing trading curve, but the fact that the liquidity distribution is so peaked makes it flatter, closer in this case to the current price, which is close to 1, let's say. So you see these components where the reserve curve is flattening out is where there's actually more liquidity in the contract. And this is the more global perspective, where if given this left-hand side liquidity distribution, trades would completely follow along this line on the right. And again, liquidity providers are thus given the freedom to set this curve on the right-hand side for traders. And so the final key takeaways from V3 are that liquidity providers can mint liquidity at specific intervals. This might come with, this might give you higher fees, but there are some risks involved. And the state of the contract is given by these parameters that liquidity providers change the liquidity of and traders change the price. So with that, that kind of long exposition on Uniswap V3, we're ready to kind of delve into the main tools that we use in this work. The first is that we express the liquidity provider's profit and loss over specific price sequences. So the time horizons that we're looking at, so for this, we're going to assume that V3 contracts are secondary markets. And going forward, what this means is that we're going to differentiate between the market price of an asset and the contract price. And typically, we're going to assume that the contract price is going to be following the market price. And as such, we're going to be needing to keep track of these two pairs over a given time horizon. And these aren't necessarily the same, but they'll be close, assuming arbitrage. And there are other works that express the optimal arbitrage that can happen in a V2 contract. And we're going to be assuming a finite time horizon of these contract market price sequences. Now we're going to consider a single LP in a V3 contract. And we're going to look at the decision problem of what happens when they allocate liquidity over all the buckets. Remember, we have these to negative M to N buckets. An allocation of a liquidity provider is just simply going to be a vector of how much liquidity I put in a bucket. And what we're going to begin, we're going to assume that there's just a fixed sequence of contract market prices. And then we'll decompose profit and loss over this fixed sequence to begin with. Well, the first thing is that over the sequence, the liquidity provider is going to earn units of token A and units of token B. And this is in both, remember, when trades are sent, when I send token A to the contract, that's what's skimmed as fees for me. And when I send token B to the contract as a trader, this skims token B for the LP. And so both of these expressions of how much is in terms of token A and token B are given by these expressions FA and FB. At the same time, the liquidity provider is also going to suffer an impermanent loss. And by this, I mean what is expressed by impermanent loss is the difference in value that the LP would have has from removing their assets at the end of the sequence, as opposed to what would have happened if they had just simply kept their assets as is from the beginning. And this quantity is always going to be non-zero, non-negative, and we'll express this as IL, impermanent loss. And with these expressions, which one can find in the paper, we actually get a very simple expression of profit and loss, which is we convert the token A at the end of the time horizon to token B, as that's the numeraire, and we just simply add the fees and subtract the impermanent loss. And another way of thinking about this is that this is if a liquidity provider were actually borrowing the assets in terms of token A, token B to begin with, this would be their profit or loss at the end of the time horizon. And the interesting actually as a result is that it turns out that if you fix the contract market price sequence over the time horizon, these functions are all independent of other liquidity providers, and they're linear in the liquidity allocation that the LP has. And so let's take a moment to think about that. So a little bit kind of intuition for why this is the case. This is the case due to the fact that the price sequence is fully exogenous and independent of my liquidity distribution. And one way of thinking about this is that imagine that I promise you that the price is going to increase a certain amount over time. Then with full knowledge of the fact that that's going to happen, if I allocate liquidity over the interval of it increasing, then I am getting more fees, but at the same time, if there's more liquidity over the interval of that price jump, more volume of trade has to be passed through in order to actually make that price change. And ultimately, since I'm earning a proportional amount of fees, things balance out. And really, actually, the expression becomes it only depends on what I do. It's a fully decision theoretic expression. And so with that in mind, what we look at is rather than looking at a deterministic price sequence, let's imagine that there's a distribution of these given by capital P, and we're going to be focusing on liquidity independent distributions, which distills this fact that my liquidity doesn't affect this distribution of prices. And in general, my liquidity is going to affect this distribution for many reasons. Not just simply the mechanics of the contract, but also potentially the desirability of trades for traders. But this is a reasonable assumption for small liquidity providers. And we call these sequences liquidity independent. And so now that we can then optimize over random realizations of sequences. We can take the expectation of this expression from P&L. This is going to be linear as the expectation of linear functions. And we can also add risk aversion to the mix to get a concave expression for P&L in the risk averse case. And we can turn this all actually into a convex optimization problem. And the way that we approximately solve this problem is by sampling from the distribution at hand, using the empirical distribution, and using gradient descent to solve this method, this convex optimization problem. Now, okay, so everything that I talked about until now was looking at the problem of the optimal liquidity allocation. I mentioned that we're going to be looking at the parameters of the contract as well, and the implications that they have for different choices of parameters for gas fees. And the reason for this is that in general, if you have a finer partition of price space, this is going to benefit liquidity providers. And this isn't hard to see because as buckets become finer, then any strategy that I could have employed in the coarser bucketing, I can do in the finer bucketing. So I should be doing better. I can't do worse, at least. And so this benefits liquidity providers, but at the same time, and as a side note, actually, this can potentially eventually benefit traders. If there's more liquidity in a contract, there's less slippage. So this is something potentially desirable. However, this comes at a price in the sense that it becomes more difficult for the contract to keep track of the state of liquidity providers if there's a very fine partition. And the computational overhead gets passed on to traders in terms of gas fees. And so a simple proxy for this computational overhead is simply how many times does a sequence, a contract market price sequence, cross one of these active ticks. And I mentioned before, an active tick is the end point of a liquidity provider's position. And it's important to know this because as you switch, as you go over one of these active ticks, the contract needs to reevaluate what the active liquidity is and who the active liquidity providers are. So we let this quantity gas of the given distribution and the bucketing scheme represent the expected number of crossings as a proxy for these gas fees. And so with all that, we can start to get to the computational results. So the first thing is I mentioned that we're going to be looking at a contract market price sequence. Well, the way that we model a contract market price sequence is that we use a geometric binomial random walk, and we take discrete values from an exponentially spaced prices with base of omega, and a bandwidth parameter for this geometric bound GBRW given by W and capital W. And we use maximum likelihood estimates with historical data from between ETH and Bitcoin and ETH and USDT to inform parameter settings for this in low and high volatility regimes. So here, the bandwidth corresponds to volatility, partially at least. And so we have these two parameter settings for low and high volatility. And we're looking at prices that are roughly around parity. So this, again, could be more seeming like coins that are correlated like two stable coin pairs, or ETH and Bitcoin being more correlated. And we're looking at a time horizon, in this case, of roughly 2 hours. which corresponds to this T of 100. Now, and the way that we model so that's the way that market prices are sampled. We're going to model the dynamics of contract and market prices with arbitrage and non-arbitrage trade, where essentially the sequence is going to evolve over epochs, where first market price is going to change, and then there's going to be a certain amount of uninformed non-arbitrage trade that's simply going to be an upward or downward flow of price. And if at any moment of time their contract prices deviate by a specific amount from market prices, arbitrage is going to kick in and bring contract prices back to close to market prices. And so with all of that, so we have our distribution, we have our optimization problem, and we have our ways of computing the expected gas fees. We can actually now put it all together and see what results we get. So the first thing that we see is we look at the effect of bucket sizes on profit and loss and gas costs. And so in both of these graphs, the capital delta on the x-axis is tick spacing. So remember, larger tick spacing means a coarser partition. In the limit, this becomes V2. And smaller ones are very fine partitions. And on the left, well, both of these graphs represent, the blue lines represent the profit and loss, the utility that liquidity providers get under an optimal allocation. And the red lines represent the number of crossings that happen in expectation. And so what you can see in both of these is, well, the left-hand graph is for a risk-averse liquidity provider, and the right-hand one is for apologies. Left hand is a risk-neutral liquidity provider. Right hand is a risk-averse liquidity provider. But we see that roughly, as the partitions, as the partitions get finer, which is closer to the left of the x-axis, there is a larger profit and loss to be had for liquidity providers. But at the same time, the red plot also goes up, which there are more crossings. And again, this is what we expected. On the other hand, as the delta parameter increases, we see decreased profit and loss, but decreased crossings. And in the limit, it actually approaches this dotted line, which is the profit that you would get for V2 position. And so what we also look at is we have these two objectives. We have the liquidity provider's earnings, and we also have the gas fees. So you can't simultaneously maximize both of these. So what we do is we treat this as a multi-objective optimization problem, and we modulate the partitions of price space, and we see the performance with respect to both of these metrics as we change these partitions. And we're going to be looking at exponentially spaced out price partitions. Again, similar to what Uniswap is doing. We're simply changing the base of the exponent, and we're looking at tick spacing as a parameter. And then we get plots like this. So in this plot, each of the rows is different levels of risk aversion, from risk neutral to most risk averse, from top to bottom. And the left-hand side of these plots, what we're doing is we're mapping the Pareto frontier. We're mapping where every single one of these dots is a specific price partition given by a base of an exponent, theta. The colors all correspond to a same base, and the different points correspond to different delta values. And in fact, as delta becomes smaller, you have finer price partitions, and so opt becomes larger. So really, as the graphs go up to the top right corner, that's as delta is becoming smaller. And again, you see what we see, the performance of many of these different price partitions, but the most salient feature is the right column, where what we've done is we've actually grayed out the points that are Pareto dominated by others. And what we see is this kind of kaleidoscope of colors. And the takeaway here is that there are many different points on the Pareto frontier from different price partitions. And so a concrete recommendation might be to allow more functionality in how to partition price space, as contracts might want to strike different balances between liquidity providers, profit and loss, and the gas fees passed on to the traders. And what we can do is we can also distill risk aversion, the effects of it, and see what impact they have. And we see, as expected for a liquidity provider, as we increase their risk aversion, their expected profit and loss decreases, but so does the variance. So it's working as expected. An interesting observation, though, is that qualitatively, their liquidity provision strategies become more spread out as they become more risk averse. And that's what this plot is showing. As you can see, the risk aversion is being increased. And as we go forward, these plots are becoming wider, and liquidity providers are allocating their liquidity over multiple buckets as they become more risk averse. The model that we had for contract market price dynamics, remember, had non-arbitrage trade and arbitrage trade. And at the end of the day, non-arbitrage trade is a large part of where the fees actually come from for liquidity providers. And so in these graphs, there are two parameters that contribute to non-arbitrage trade, namely the quantity of non-arbitrage trades and the magnitude of each of these. And what both of these show is that in all scenarios, the left column is risk neutral and the right column is risk averse. And each of the rows is a different one of these parameters that contribute to non-arbitrage trade. But the x-axis being a proxy for non-arbitrage trade, as that increases, you see both increased profit and loss for liquidity providers, but you also see more ticks are crossed. So again, we get this dual trade-off for that parameter. We also looked at some preliminary work with respect to how the fee rates would affect the optimal profit and loss and essentially these Pareto frontiers for different liquidity providers. And this is these results I think are to be taken with a little bit more grain of salt, because fees actually have a much wider impact on the dynamics of a contract. Because if they're lower, you get more trades, and if you get more trades, then you might get more fees. And if you get more trades, you might have more liquidity. So really, this is a very complicated interplay. But we see kind of as risk aversion increases, we have a larger striation of at least the performance of different contracts with respect to different fee rates. And finally, we also looked at different settings for the contract market price sequence. We remember we had this family of geometrically bounded random walks, and the stochastic process that's generating these liquidity independent distributions, we modulated a low volatility process to a high volatility process. And we saw something that we would have expected as well, which is on the left-hand side, we see a low volatility process, and the right-hand side, high volatility. And in general, the higher the volatility, the more spread out a liquidity provider will make their position, given how risk averse they are. And again, this makes sense because price deviations are riskier when you have more concentrated positions as a liquidity provider. And again, this is similar plots to before for the Pareto frontier. Namely, here we have the Pareto frontier of different partitions of price space, but in the left-hand side, it's a low volatility regime, and on the right-hand side, it's a high volatility regime. And we simply see that as volatility is increased, in particular for these bottom two on the right-hand side graph, we see a much sharper Pareto curve. And so there are kind of sharper contrasts to be made. Quickly the contract will modulate between trading off one objective versus another. And so to just conclude this talk, I'll kind of give an overview of what we covered and talk about some future directions. So again, this is an initial foray into V3 contracts and liquidity provider incentives. And what we've done is we formulated a static optimization problem for small liquidity providers, and while also simultaneously looking at the surplus gas fees that are paid by traders under different partitions. So what we see, the big takeaway mostly, is that a richer family of partitions gives us a much richer family of trade-offs between liquidity providers and traders in this static context. And some future directions now that we're looking at. So the first, which we're currently working on, is on optimizing over dynamic strategies over a given time horizon. Again, a liquidity provider doesn't have to simply keep their liquidity and remove it after a given time horizon. They can be moving it back and forth at a given cost. And so that's a direct next step we're working on. But ideally, we would like to also introduce to remove the assumption of liquidity independent sequences. Again, this exogenous price assumption gives us a lot, but it's a very strong assumption. And once we add a dependence on liquidity provision strategies, then we are actually going to recover not a decision theoretic problem, but a game theoretic problem. And with this, it'd be interesting to see how rational liquidity providers are actually in Uniswap contracts. And ideally, with this insight on rationality, trying to interpret aggregate liquidity distributions as a belief. Well, thank you. That's the end of my talk. I'm glad, as I mentioned before, it's really wonderful to have been invited. Thank you so much. I'd be more than glad to answer any questions offline. Thank you so much. Have a great day.